I We back. This is my yearly complaint about affixes. If you can see right here, about a year ago, I complained about affixes as well. Talked about what's wrong with affixes in Mythic Plus. And at this point, there was a lot of community sentiment and a lot of discussion talking about how affixes felt like they were too burdensome on the healer. Since then, those burdensome affixes on the healer have largely been removed. Quaking, not Quaking, Quaking got removed, but Grievous got removed and Explosive got removed. Those were the two dominant ones that were like, oh, these are healer affixes. They have to do the entire thing. And now we're only kind of left with bursting as like the dominant healer affix, but people are still complaining about affixes, myself included. And so today we're going to be kind of talking about what's wrong with affixes. And something that I actually talked about in this video back in like February of last year is kind of something that I want to show off at the very beginning of this video again, just so it kind of resonates with people and kind of again, restate what my position is as to what I think affixes should do in dungeons.
To remove one of these rows of affixes, make sure that you're consolidating down the dungeon experience into, like, I feel like you should be playing a large portion of your dungeon experience should be the dungeon itself. Not half of the experience is the dungeon, and then other half of the experience is making sure that you're set up for dealing with these affixes. Because
okay, so being set up for dealing with affixes, I would argue, is still way too problematic in the current state of the game. And I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but I did get a really, really salty after having a key session during bolstering where it was like, this is so unfun, this is a really unfun affix to deal with. And then some people were like, oh yeah, just delete all affixes and stuff like that. So let's talk about what affixes point in the game is, what maybe my solution to affixes would be, and kind of talk about maybe the progression of affixes over the course of Dragonflight. So after this video was created, we've actually had a lot that's changed with affixes. First and foremost, Explosive, Quaking, and Grievous got removed. Raging got reworked. And then there was some new affixes that got added, including, Afflicted, Incorporeal, and Entangling. Entangling, pretty good. Afflicted and Incorporeal, though, continue to kind of be more or less the same issue, where you're not necessarily playing the dungeon, but something that I said here is being set up well for the affixes going into the dungeon, and you still have to be set up well for the affixes going into the dungeon, especially with Incorporeal and Afflicted, you could argue, where there's a lot of spots where Incorporeal and Afflicted are both probably the most important part of the dungeon, where if you don't have a multitude of like off dispels in your group, you're just going to have Afflicted go off. And if you don't have like the right comp or like people paying attention to Incorporeal, you're going to have Incorporeal go off. And the punishment value is maybe just a little bit too high. Not even a little bit, a lot of bit too high with these. And so, whenever we went back and looked at how affixes were in the past, I think they've definitely moved in the right direction in the past year. But I still think they're too impactful in the current state of the game. And I think that this is actually really, really easy to tell that they're too impactful, because whenever you look at how people, just look at the community perception of this, where it's like, unironically though, what affixes are fun? Any of them? Can we just get rid of them at this point? Like, people are literally so tired of affixes. It's just like, delete affixes. We need fun affixes. Delete affixes. There's no affix that's fun. What sadist decided that it should be bolstering fortified? And there's a lot of people too that now, since the dungeon squish, aren't going to even be engaging with like the level 9 affix row. Instead of actually going over that level 10 barrier that gives you that third affix, I've seen a lot of people just being like, I'm just going to do 9s for the rest of my life. I get the best gear from 9s anyways, and I don't have to deal with bolstering ever again. And that's like, I think that that's problematic. I think that, Mythic Plus is fun, and I think that pushing keys is really fun. And so whenever you're adding an extra layer of friction on top of that's like really not fun, that's particularly problematic. And so, like, dude, I think the best way of describing this is like, look at the history of bolstering. So bolstering has existed since the inception of Mythic Plus back in Legion. And if you look at the initial iteration of bolstering, it would bolster allies within 45 yards on death, permanently increasing their maximum health and damage done by 20%. Maximum health and damage done by 20%, which is crazy. And then eventually that got changed to 30 yards and increasing their maximum health only by 15%, but the damage done still be 20%, and it still stacks. Actually, no. So, yeah. Okay, so that was exactly the change. And then, after that, it then got nerfed to be only they changed the stacking in 9.1.5. So 9.1, it was 30 yards. And then 915, they changed the stacking and how stacking works on it. Now it stacks like Iron Fur, where it's independent stacks and they'll fall off eventually, stuff like that, to allow them to be okay. And then they changed them to no longer affect bosses eventually, and that was continuing to improve in the right direction. And then in 10.1, in season 2, like we were talking about, they removed the health gain on bolstering as well. And in season 4, I'm still tweeting that bolstering sucks and is unfun. And so clearly this is an issue not necessarily about the history of bolstering or the history of bursting or the history of any other affix that's been around since the inception, but it's more of an issue of what's wrong with affixes just as a whole. And we can kind of take a look at the affix rows and kind of talk about this just a little bit. So what's the point of affixes? The point of affixes are this, from Blizzard's perspective. They're to create friction with the players. They're to change the weeks to make sure that they're not feeling the same. And they're to give players just a little bit of a challenge. I think by and large, they accomplish those goals by Blizzard's perspective. The problem is that they don't accomplish them in the right ways. And Blizzard's kind of always been kind of tinkering with affixes since their inception. I don't think very rarely do we go an entire expansion without them messing with affixes in some capacity, whether it be when you're getting affixes, like seasonal affixes, adding and dropping seasonal affixes and changing a bunch of different stuff. Blizzard very rarely goes an entire expansion without tinkering with affixes in some capacity. But I think that they're still kind of missing the mark as to why players give such resounding negative feedback towards affixes. And I watched actually like a developer interview about a different video game. And they were kind of talking about how as a game developer, you have to have that added layer of friction. And sometimes your burden of responsibility is going to be to make the players, instead of blame other players for mistakes and that guy sucks and that's why we didn't time that key. Instead, sometimes have an unfair element to it where it's oh, okay, the affix was just out there to get you and there's not really much you can do about that. And that, oh man, that sucks. We go again. But I think with affixes in an infinitely scaling system, Mythic Plus doesn't necessarily need that, right? You can always just do a higher key until you're getting one shot by something. So you don't need that necessarily that much additional friction on top of what keystone levels and in an infinitely scaling system provides. And so for Blizzard's perspective, I think that they do kind of accomplish their goals, but I think they accomplish them the wrong way. I will say something that affixes do right. They make the weeks feel unique. And I think that that's actually important. And that's something that I would love to keep moving forward. I think that is whenever I'm talking about this video, that is a main goal and probably a main priority that Blizzard should continue to maintain, is making sure that the weeks continue to feel unique. Now, the issue with affixes is kind of the same problem that we had back in season 1. They're just too impactful. And you end up playing the affixes, or you end up, worrying about what the affixes do inside of the dungeons as opposed to how to play the dungeon itself. And so if you look at these affixes here, bolstering in very specific spots, and we had this in Everbloom last season, where the Enlashers went the entire season doing on-death affixes. And that meant that Everbloom on weeks that had bursting or bolstering was nearly unplayable. And from Blizzard's perspective, I don't expect them to actually be able to know what mobs are going to be really cringe with on-death affixes every single week. I don't expect them to, want or need to spend developer time to go and fix these things. I will say though that if they're going to have something like bolstering, they're going to have to make sure that it's perfect, because stuff like bolstering sucks. But then whenever you get things like Everbloom, I would say that's unacceptable. And Blizzard, I think, just generally does a really good job with Mythic Plus. I think Mythic Plus is sick. But I think that bolstering is, frankly, just completely unacceptable. And the same thing goes for Incorporeal and Afflicted, where there are a decent amount of compositions. And I made a video about Incorporeal and Afflicted because I was just so salty last season. But I don't want this to be about a very specific affix, because I think it's not an affix issue. I think it's a systematic problem where all affixes have a problem, where Incorporeal and Afflicted, if you don't have a composition or you don't have players that are good enough to be able to deal with these affixes, it's just nearly impossible. And they've nerfed Afflicted again. And they nerfed Afflicted to be, I want to say it's 12-second long cast now. That way, there's a lot more leeway for you to actually get 2 dispels on the Afflicted if you're just one person who has a dispel in your group. Say your healer is the only person with a dispel in your group. They're able to get a second dispel on the Afflicted a lot easier. Where before, your dispel cooldown's an 8-second thing, 8-second CD, and it was a 10-second cast. And so now it's a 12-second cast, and so now you have a little bit more leeway. And these are positive changes that they're making to the affixes, but I think fundamentally the issue with the affixes is that they're too hard and they're too punishing. Where Incorporeal and Afflicted, it's not about the duration of the cast time on Incorporeal nor Afflicted. It's actually about compositional setup beforehand of zoning into the dungeon and having to make sure that you're playing that correctly. And same goes with bolstering, where it's like sometimes it's about compositional setup, but it's actually kind of about the dungeon more so than anything else. And it's actually about like, you know, the awareness of knowing what you can and can't pull, and knowing kiting patterns and stuff like that, and knowing when you can and can't get out of the dungeon. And for Sanguine, it's kind of a similar thing where it's like, you know, it's not necessarily an issue of like the difficulty of Sanguine. It's more of an issue of like the player's ability to be able to move bombs out of Sanguine. It's the tank's knowledge about the pack to be able to kite correctly. It's bringing disrupt style effects to be able to knock mobs out of Sanguine, and having the awareness to know that I should be taunting this mob out of Sanguine. And it's less like, it's more about like the players and, you know, the strain that's put onto the players as opposed to how well the affixes are balanced. Because actually, I think the affixes, and if you look at the TGP, they're relatively well balanced against one another. You know, they're maybe within like a key level delta, probably more like a half key level delta from like top to bottom for affixes, which is fine. I don't think it's like perfect by any means, nor will it ever be perfect. But in general, I don't think affixes are balanced poorly. So I don't think it's a balancing issue. I think it's more of like a design space problem where it just feels too unfun, and then you end up like sitting in these situations where you're just not enjoying playing the affixes, and you have a lot of people like we saw on Twitter that were just kind of talking about like how affixes were super unfun. I actually don't think many affixes are that bad, and they're sitting there to make friction and make the weeks feel unique, but I want to see a massive overhaul. And for me, whenever I'm thinking of like a affix overhaul, I think we just frankly have too many affixes. Or maybe it's just that we have too many negative affixes. It's more just like we don't need that many negative affixes. I think Tyrannical and Fortified are always going to be balancing problems. I don't think that they're necessarily within the scope of this video. I think the affix 2 and the affix 3 stuff, like the 5 and the 10 rows, are definitely the bigger scope of this video. Where I think it's like having 2 rows of like these detrimental affixes is always going to be a major dilemma for just making sure that the dungeons are fun. And I think that whenever it's like creating this friction makes the dungeons unfun, then we really have to reassess. And for Blizzard's perspective, they probably need to reassess like what the affixes are realistically doing. And I would love for Blizzard to actually kind of try to experiment with affixes. The M Plus team, I generally think, does a great job of making sure that Mythic Plus is like accessible to a lot of players and to make it pretty fun. And I think that's something that they did this season with the Dungeon Squish is awesome. I think that opening up M0 as a more relevant part of the end game is very good for a large portion of the player base. It's something that like accessibility to M0 and to be able to do timerless keys and just like the state of the season as a whole, I think is pretty good. But I think just in general for like the players who want to play the dungeons and continue to like actually push past that level 10 barrier, affixes are just always going to, not always, affixes in their current state are going to always be a problem. And that's why I think that Blizzard should be looking to experiment with some affix overhauls. It seems like the M Plus team generally has a lot more leeway to kind of experiment and try new things. And even if this does require like a couple of seasons of like testing and playing around with new affix combinations or kind of trying new stuff, I think that would actually be sick, because we've seen the affix and the M Plus team do a lot of cool stuff lately. I think one of the biggest things that we got out of this expansion in Dragonflight was rotating dungeons every single season. And I think that was actually just a home run. Like that is actually one of the biggest positives that I think has come out of this expansion is rotating dungeons. I think that Blizzard just did a spectacular job with that. And I think that if they really start taking a hack at affixes and think outside of the box, I think that they could actually reach and accomplish something that's super sick. But again, I think that affixes should stay. I'm not one of these people who's like an affix hater, and it just needs to be removed. But it's more just like they need to create a challenge that's a little bit different. This guy says right here, why can't they create a fun challenge? They end up creating an annoying one. The dungeons themselves are already annoying, and you're already up against the friction of like the timer. You're up against the friction of the dungeon level. Like, is this actually doable? Am I going to get one shot? You're up against all these issues with the dungeon itself. And so then adding like a multiplicative variable like affixes on top of that, and particularly like really, really punishing ones sometimes, like bolstering and like sanguine and stuff like that, is too much. Anyways, those are my thoughts. Again, I thought it was kind of funny that I just made one a year ago. They actually kind of reworked affixes, and then we're still having the exact same conversation where I'm kind of still bringing up the exact same points. I think there's too many affix rows. I would be looking to chop one. Again, I like affixes. I think they should stay. I don't think they should be removed. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your video. Great rest of your day. Goodbye. I didn't mean Great Roaster video. Whatever, doesn't matter.